Somewhere in the middle of the Australian outback, hundreds of miles from the nearest river, there's a jagged ridge of black rock that most people will never see, and most people will never hear of. But that ridge did something almost nothing else on Earth has ever done. It produced over 300 million tons of ore. It generated billions of dollars, and it gave birth to a company that would go on to become the largest mining corporation on the planet. Here's the strange part. When it was first discovered, nobody wanted it. The man who found it thought he was standing on a worthless pile of tin. He was wrong. He was standing on top of the richest silver-lead-zinc deposit ever found. And what happened next is one of the wildest stories in industrial history. A tale of desperate boundary riders, overnight millionaires, toxic dust storms, armed strikebreakers, and a corporate giant that eventually turned its back on the very town that made it. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to dig into how a barren desert outpost built the financial backbone of a nation, fought some of the bloodiest labor wars in the country's history, and what happened when the earth finally stopped giving. And somewhere in the middle of it, we're going to answer a question that still lingers over that empty ridge today. Why did the company walk away from the town that gave it its name? This is the story of Broken Hill, New South Wales. To understand it, you have to understand the outback itself, not the postcard version, but the real one. Red dirt that cracks under the sun, wind that carries dust for 100 miles, a silence so complete it feels like the whole continent is holding its breath. This is not a place that invites civilization. This is a place that survival experts avoid. And yet, in the space of a single generation, this exact patch of nowhere became one of the wealthiest square miles on Earth. It built mansions. It built a company that would one day operate on 6 continents. And it built something else too, a labour movement so fierce it helped rewrite the rules of how working people in Australia would be treated for the next 100 years. But every fortune this size comes with a shadow, and Broken Hill's shadow was long, poisoned lungs, buried strikers, and a corporate parent that would eventually pack up and leave. So let's go back to the beginning. Back before the money, back before the fame. Back before the fame, back to 1883, when this was nothing but silence, heat, and a lone man on a horse. Picture the barrier ranges in the early 1880s. This isn't lush farmland. It's scorched clay and ironstone, carved by wind into strange, jagged shapes. Rain is a rumor here. Drought is the default setting. Anyone trying to make a living off this land is fighting the climate every single day just to keep livestock alive. Now picture a boundary rider, a man whose entire job is patrolling the fences of a sheep station on horseback, day after day in this heat. His name is Charles Rasp and he works for Mount Gyps Station. One day, out on his rounds, something catches his eye. A dark, jagged outcrop breaking the flat monotony of the landscape. Most people would have ridden straight past it. Rasp didn't. He took a sample, he examined it. And based on what he could tell with the primitive assessment tools available to a station hand in the outback, he came to a conclusion. This looked like tin oxide. Not exactly the discovery of the century, tin was useful, but nowhere near as valuable as what was about to be found underneath it. Still, Rasp wasn't about to ignore a hunch entirely. He brought the idea to a handful of his fellow workers, men earning modest station wages, men who understood exactly how little margin for error existed in a life like theirs. Together, 7 of them pooled their money, £70 each. Not a fortune. In fact, for most of them, it was close to everything they had. They called themselves the Syndicate of Seven, and they staked their claim on ground that virtually everyone else in the region considered a joke, a useless ridge, a gamble for fools. What none of them knew yet was that they weren't standing on top of a modest tin deposit. They were standing on the edge of the single richest silver-lead-zinc ore body the world had ever seen, a geological freak so dense, with mineral wealth, that when the first proper assays came back from the laboratory, technicians had to double-check their own equipment. The numbers didn't seem possible. They were about to find out just how possible they were. The moment the assay results confirmed what was buried beneath that ridge, everything changed. Deep in what would become known as the Rasp shaft, miners struck native silver and rich chlorobromide ore, minerals so concentrated that fortunes could be measured in single wagon loads. Word travels fast when the word is silver. Within an astonishingly short window, the calm financial circles of Adelaide and Melbourne turned into something closer to a feeding frenzy. Shares in the fledgling operation that had cost ordinary investors pocket change were suddenly worth staggering sums. Clerks, shopkeepers, and speculators who had put in a few pounds on a whim were waking up to paper fortunes. This wasn't just a mining boom, this was mania. And on the ground, in the desert itself, the transformation was just as dramatic and considerably less glamorous. What had been empty scrubland turned almost overnight into a sprawling, chaotic frontier town. Timber shanties went up in a hurry, streets filled with dust and noise. Thousands of fortune seekers converged on a place that had no permanent river, no reliable water source, and no infrastructure to support a sudden population explosion. Here's a detail that tells you everything about life in early Broken Hill. Water was often more expensive than beer. Clean drinking water had to be hauled in or collected with painstaking effort, while alcohol flowed freely through the hastily built hotels that sprang up to serve the new arrivals. Alongside the champagne toasts and celebratory nights in those hotels, disease crept through the makeshift camps. Typhus outbreaks tore through communities with no proper sanitation. This was prosperity and peril, sitting side by side in the same dusty street. It was a wild, unregulated rush, equal parts opportunity and danger. But rushes like this one rarely stay wild for long. Big money has a way of organizing itself. And what came next would take Broken Hill from frontier chaos to full-blown corporate empire. In 1885, the loose, speculative energy of the boom crystallized into something far more permanent. The operation was formally incorporated as the Broken Hill Proprietary Company Limited, a name that, over the following century, would become one of the most powerful in global industry. You know today simply as BHP. The speed of its rise was extraordinary. Within just a few years, this company, built on a remote outback claim, had become one of the most profitable corporations anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere. But turning raw ore into that kind of wealth required infrastructure on a scale the outback had never seen. Smelting operations were established right on site, and with them came towering chimneys and massive slag heaps, mountains of toxic industrial byproduct that would loom over the town for generations, visible from miles away, a permanent reminder of exactly what was happening beneath the surface. None of this was easy in a place this isolated. Timber for mine shafts and construction had to be hauled from rivers hundreds of miles away because the desert itself offered nothing usable. Engineers laid entire railway lines across unforgiving terrain just to keep ore, supplies, and people moving. This wasn't just mining. This was an entire logistical war against distance itself, waged and won by sheer capital and determination. And as the company grew, so did its influence. This was no longer just a mining operation. It was becoming powerful enough to shape national infrastructure decisions and lean on government policy. A company born in a wooden hut on a sheep station, run by men who'd started with 70 pounds apiece, was now dictating terms to a continent. But here's the thing about industrial empires built on extraction. The wealth accumulating in boardrooms and stock exchanges had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was over 1,000 feet underground, where a very different reality was unfolding. The deeper the shafts plunged into the silver, the darker the air became above ground, and the darker life became below it. Working the Broken Hill mines meant confronting dangers that went far beyond the usual hazards of hard labor. Lead poisoning, known medically as plumbism, was rampant among miners handling ore rich in the very metal that made the town wealthy. Minus-isthesis, a devastating lung disease caused by prolonged exposure to fine mineral dust, quietly destroyed the health of men who had spent years underground. Add to that the constant threat of rock falls and heat so intense it pushed the human body to its absolute limits, and you start to understand the real price behind every ounce of silver pulled from that ridge. The workers understood this price better than anyone, and they weren't willing to simply absorb it in silence. Broken Hill became the site of some of the fiercest labour confrontations in Australian history. In 1892, and again in a bitter, prolonged standoff spanning 1919 into 1920, miners faced down armed police, hired strikebreakers, and determined corporate lockouts. These weren't polite negotiations. These were prolonged, exhausting battles of endurance, where entire families went without income for months, betting everything on the belief that conditions had to change. And remarkably, they won concessions that reshaped labour standards far beyond the town itself. A 35-hour working week, meaningful safety reforms, protections that miners elsewhere in the country could only dream of just years earlier. These victories didn't come from goodwill. They came from sheer grinding endurance against a corporate giant that had every financial incentive to resist. It's not an exaggeration to call Broken Hill the spiritual capital of the Australian labour movement. The scars left by lead dust and collapsed tunnels were real, and so was the resolve they produced. Workers in the darkest, most dangerous conditions imaginable forced one of the most powerful companies in the hemisphere to yield. But even the fiercest labour victories couldn't change one unavoidable fact. No matter how well the workers were treated, no matter how profitable the mine remained, every ore body, no matter how vast, eventually runs dry. As the decades wore on, the richest, highest-grade silver seams began to deplete. And BHP, the corporate giant that Broken Hill itself had created, started looking elsewhere. The company progressively shifted its focus towards steel manufacturing in places like Newcastle and Port Kembla, industrial hubs far removed from the desert that had built its fortune. By 1939, BHP had wound down its founding operations in Broken Hill entirely, leaving the town to face a question every resource-dependent community eventually confronts. What happens when the reason you exist decides to leave? For a town built entirely around extraction, this could easily have meant a slow death. But Broken Hill didn't simply fade away. Decades of mining had stripped the surrounding landscape bare, and without vegetation to hold the soil, the town faced blinding dust storms severe enough to threaten daily life. In response, an ambitious environmental remediation effort took shape, the creation of what's known as the Regeneration Reserve, a deliberately planted buffer of vegetation around the city designed to hold the soil and the dust at bay. That reserve is one of the reasons Broken Hill still stands today, rather than existing only in old photographs. The town went on to become Australia's first heritage-listed city. Its distinctive mining-era streetscape and rugged surroundings later immortalised on film as the backdrop for Mad Max 2. Beneath the surface, secondary mining operations have continued in more limited form, a quiet echo of the boom that once defined this place. Broken Hill's survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned the same way everything else in this story was earned, through stubbornness, adaptation, and a refusal to simply disappear when the easy money moved on. Today, if you stand near the old line of load, you can still see the massive slag heaps rising over the town. Dark, man-made mountains overlooking streets that once buzzed with speculative fever and desperate strikes. They stand there like monuments, not just to what was extracted from the ground, but to everything that extraction demanded in return. Because Broken Hill's real legacy was never just measured in tons of silver, lead, and zinc. It's measured in the 8-hour workday and the safety protections that miners fought for in conditions most of us can barely imagine. Reforms that quietly shaped labour standards across an entire country. So here's a question worth sitting with. When a community gives its blood, its health, and its earth to build a global corporation, does that company owe the town something in return, forever? Let me know what you think in the comments. In the end, the desert always reclaims what it's owed. The tents are gone. The speculative frenzy has long since faded. Even the company that once dictated a continent's infrastructure eventually moved on. But the stories remain, written into the stone, the iron, and the silence of that jagged ridge, proof that even in the most unforgiving corner of the map, human ambition can leave a mark that outlasts everything, including the very fortune that built it.